Hi everyone, so in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to paint a spaniel ear in acrylics, and I'm going to show you the specific layering process and the layering order that I like to use in order to tackle this complex fur texture. So let's jump into step 1. Now for me personally, I like to map in my main lights and darks first. I'm not focusing on any detail, I'm not really focusing on contrast at the moment, it's just I'm trying to make this area less overwhelming. When we look at a spaniel ear in a reference photo, we can often think, where do I start? So when I feel like that, I want to just focus on my main sets of shapes. So what I've done here is I'm mapping in my main highlights first. I'm not mixing my brightest highlight, I'm just going for a standard mid-grey and then blocking in a darker grey around it. This is my preference rather than painting a solid layer down first and then trying to put my lighter curls on top. I think that if I follow my reference photo early on by mapping in my main curls that I notice in the reference photo first, exactly as I have done here, there's only 4 or 5, but it's enough to let me know exactly where they should be accurately in terms of that reference photo. So once all of that is dry, I'm then going to start to map in more of my mid-grey. So I've got my darker grey around it, and now I can start to just soften and darken those lighter greys that I mentioned first. Because I want to be working from dark to light, I don't want to have those bright greys early on. I want to be building up all of that depth for my later layers. Now at the beginning of the video I mentioned about the layering order. This is really important with the spaniel ear. I want to be painting the curls that are closest to the skin first and leaving all of the curls that are overlapping other elements of fur until my last layers. So once I've got this level of softness in place here, there is not any brighter greys at all, but I can still see my main shapes, my main sets of curls. What I want to now do is start refining my contrast. So I'm starting to use more of my darker shadowed colours and now reinforcing and tidying up this layer, making it more accurate to my reference photo. Now if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I put a lot of focus on contrast. I worry about contrast a lot more than mixing specific colours. Because if your darks are not dark enough or your highlights aren't bright enough, the portrait, the painting will look far flatter than one where you've got beautiful contrast that's going to make the dog or the subject look far more three-dimensional with a lot more depth. So my contrast is my main aim. But my first priority, as I say, is getting the shape of the ear right. I want to make sure that I've hinted at that fur texture. Because being that I've currently got it looking how I have here, it now looks less overwhelming. I can look at my reference photo and back at my painting and know exactly which part of the curl I need to be working on. So it's at this stage where I've got nice dark shadows that I can start building up my layers. Now the most important thing when painting realism and trying to get more depth within fur is you want to be building up your layers gradually. Look just that this is a slightly lighter layer than the one previously. I've still not jumped into adding a lot of titanium white to my grey mixture. It's about adding a little bit of white each time and gradually lightening each layer as you go. This is the best way of achieving more depth with any fur, but specifically spaniel ears, because of how everything overlaps in such a way, there is always going to be a lot more variation between your lights and your darks. You're going to have more mid-tone values because every clump of fur that is overlapping another area is going to be casting a shadow underneath. So I want to make sure that I've built up these layers gradually, working with my subtle layers. So before we go on to any more of the layering process, and we've got a lot more to do here in order to build up more realism, I would just like to ask that if the tips and techniques shared in this video have been useful, if you could give it a thumbs up and a like because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. I also offer in-depth, step-by-step tutorials on my Patreon channel, and I'll link that in the description below if they're of interest. So now that I've got the main curls mapped in here, it still looks very dark, but it has to at this stage. I'm now starting to build up more of my mid-tone greys. Now when you look at a reference photo, the brightest highlights that you see first, they need to be left until the very last layer. they're sitting on the very top of the fur. They're catching more of that light. So we do want to leave that for the very end. But before we get to that stage, there are so many more layers that we need to add here to build up more depth. The longer fur, I have to make sure that I'm lengthening my brush strokes to replicate the fur texture. Now I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for painting realistic fur. I'll link that in the description if it's of interest. Now there's a few things that I mentioned there. The fur length, the fur direction and the fur thickness. All of this is really important with any fur texture. But with Spaniel ears, because the fur is generally longer unless the dog has recently had a haircut, we're going to have to make sure that we lengthen our brush strokes properly. We don't want to be causing really long brush strokes because you're going to end up with something like collie fur, so we don't want to do that. But again, if they're too short, we're going to make it look like potentially a Labrador ear. So it's about finding the right balance. We then get onto the fur thickness. You can see here many times when this clip is all in real time just how much the bristles are bending. They're not excessive, but they're not maintaining that straight position either. That's showing that I've got very minimal amount of pressure applied to the brush, just enough to get a little bit of a curve in that brush stroke. That's going to help to create more of a natural feel to each stroke that I add. I'm being very careful as well not to completely cover those darker layers that I've built up previously. The aim is never to paint over the layer underneath it. The darker layers are there to help provide those shadows in between the clumps of fur. So if we paint over them, there would be no point in putting them in the first place. So do make sure that you're studying that reference photo closely to make sure that you're mapping in your main lights and darks in the right place. Sometimes when painting Spaniel ears, because we focus on the big clumps of fur, it can start to look a little bit like a paint by number with everything too blocked in. So what I'm starting to do here is add in a couple of individual hairs and also smaller clumps of fur. So this might potentially be 3 or 4 strands of fur that are grouped together. That's going to help to break up that clumpier texture. So I want to be doing that at each layer so that I can help to build up a bit more depth. If we left all of those wispy hairs till the last layer, we might potentially then change the fur texture and we could end up with something that's a little bit more wiry looking. So for a Spaniel ear, we want to avoid that. So what I've mentioned previously is where in my other tutorials, I like to mix between my lights and my darks. I feel like I've got a really nice mid-tone range built up here and the depth is gradually building. But I do want to soften out some of the fur. So here I've now gone back to using a bit more of a darker grey and I'm now darkening the top parts of the curls. The reason being, if you look at those main curls, every curl that's overlapping another curl would be casting that shadow. So I do want to make sure that I've replicated that. You can do this through the use of a glaze. Now I speak about glazes in my slower in-depth tutorials on Patreon because for me they take a huge role in my painting process. They can completely make so much more depth. They can adjust the colour so easily even just with one layer. So again, if my in-depth tutorials on Patreon and how you would like to see me work with glazes and all of the other techniques that I use, then I will link that in the description below. I do also have a Patreon library on my website where you can see all of the tutorials that are immediately available on Patreon as soon as you sign up. So at this point, I'm now going to carry on building my layers here, working on that layering order, focusing on which part of the fur is now overlapping my current clumps of fur that I've got painted in. The best way, as I've said, to do this is do make sure that with each layer you're just lightening that mixture slightly. Don't be adding too much white and jump into your brightest highlights. It is so easy to do that, but we will reduce all of that depth, that thicker looking fur, if we do add our highlights too soon. And if you do feel like the fur, regardless of what it is, it doesn't have to be a Spaniel ear, if you do feel that it's a little bit flatter looking, you don't have as much depth as you'd like, it will probably be because you don't have enough layers built in and you've jumped to your brightest highlights too soon. The other thing, of course, could be that your contrast isn't right. So if you're using a mixture that you feel is right, it's accurate to the reference photo, but maybe those brush strokes aren't showing up as brightly as you'd like, that is a really good indication that your base layers aren't dark enough. Quite often we're worried about going too dark in case we can't lighten them back up again. But the wonderful thing with working with acrylics is that once that layer is dry, you can just paint over it if you have gone too light or you have gone too dark. Now, one thing that I will talk a lot about in my YouTube tutorials and of course on Patreon is the importance of these little hair details that overlap the background. These are going to vary depending on the length of the fur, but even short-coated breeds like Staffordshire Bull Terriers will still have a few details that overlap that background. If we don't include these and we have a harsh edge around our subject, it's going to make it look like it's a sticker that's just been stuck on that canvas. So of course we want to avoid that. So for a spaniel ear, you want to make sure that you've got the curve of these details right. Notice that they're not straight lines. There is always a curve in the middle section of that brushstroke. Now, in order to create these types of lines, I like to use a bit more of a liner brush rather than a round brush. But depending on the fur texture, if it was a thicker clump of fur, a round brush would work fine. You would just need to be a little bit more aware of the pressure you're applying to the brush. But liner brushes, or they're also called rigger brushes, can enable you to create finer lines with less pressure. So the less pressure that you apply to those brushes, the finer the line will be. If you want that to look like a thicker clump of fur, then just apply slightly more pressure. It will make the bristles spread slightly and therefore you'll create a thicker line. The one important thing when using a brush like that though is you do need the paint mixture the right consistency. If you don't have enough water in your mixture, the paint will be too thick and you won't be able to create a long line. On the other hand though, if you add too much water, it's going to be very transparent, and worst case scenario, that line, the brush stroke, might then run. So it's about having a balance between the two. You want it to just flow nicely off of that brush without any start and stop points, but that it hides that background. You want that layer to be nice and opaque. And all opaque means is just that you can't see through it. So in this case here, because I've used a nice amount of my Mars Black within that grey mixture, it's a nice opaque brushstroke. It's not showing any of that background through. So too much water and you'll end up with a transparent mixture, which is not what we want when we're painting these details that overlap the background. So the ear here and the depth that I've built up, it's looking really nice, but it's still a little bit flat. I haven't yet added my brighter highlights. This is now where I've added a little bit more of that titanium white. I've eased off on the Mars Black and I'm really focusing a little bit more now on my main highlights. Notice how I'm taking a little bit of extra time. I'm hesitating. I lift up my brush, I'm looking at my reference photo and looking at where are these brighter brush strokes. What can happen at this stage is because these highlights add a lot more depth to the painting, we get a little bit carried away and start putting them everywhere. Now what happens then is we will be changing that light source. If we do that, that one section where we have added too many highlights, it won't be balanced and in line with the rest of the painting. So you really want to make sure that you're only putting your highlights where they're required. So do study that reference photo closely. So really at this stage, there wasn't too many more highlights that I had to add here, and that's because the light source on this dog was coming from the other side, so the muzzle and the nose area was casting a little bit more of a shadow on this ear compared to the opposite side. The opposite side, I do have a lot more of my lighter grey values, so again, I want to be making sure that I'm studying that light source. But at this stage, I'm refining my contrast, going back to my importance of contrast and how this can add so much more depth. I'm darkening up my shadows with the use of glazes. I'm going to then wait for that to dry and then I can go back in and add some of these mid-grey details, those wispier hairs that I've mentioned earlier, and then this spaniel ear is going to be pretty much done. But the importance of these layers is what's going to make this spaniel ear more realistic. It's no good just working with 2 or 3 layers. We'll end up with something that's far more two-dimensional. So I do hope this tutorial has been useful, and here is a photograph of the finished painting of all 6 dogs. I really did love working on this piece. It was a larger size as well, so I was able to get a little bit more detail than I would if I was working smaller. Now if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And as I've said, if the video was useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like, give it that thumbs up, because it does make a huge difference to my channel. And if my in-depth tutorials on Patreon are of interest, I will link that in the description below as well. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week.